He just offered to fix his neighbor's fence for free, a simple act of kindness in a world that had offered him little of it. He had no idea the woman on the other side of that broken fence was a billionaire heiress hiding from a life she desperately wanted to forget, and that his simple offer would rebuild more than just a property line. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. The morning air was thick with the scent of damp earth and cut grass, the kind of stillness that settled over suburban streets just before the world woke up. Leo stood by his kitchen window, a chipped ceramic mug warming his palms, watching his daughter chase a stray dandelion seed across the lawn. At 7, Maya moved with a kind of boundless joy that felt both miraculous and fragile, a bright spark in the quiet gray of their lives. He took a slow sip of his coffee, the bitter taste a familiar jolt. Their life was a carefully balanced equation of scraped-together paychecks and a love so fierce it sometimes ached. He worked as a carpenter, a fixer of things, but lately it felt like he was just patching holes in a life that was steadily taking on water. The phone bill sat on the counter, a stark white reminder of what was due. The transmission in his truck had started to whine, a sound he knew all too well and couldn't afford to address. But Maya didn't know any of that. Her world was backyard adventures, stories before bed, and the unwavering certainty that her dad could fix anything. He protected that certainty with everything he had. His gaze drifted past his own yard to the house next door. It had been sold a few months ago, the quiet, elderly couple replaced by a new owner he'd only glimpsed once or twice, a woman who moved with a kind of deliberate silence, like she was trying not to leave footprints. The house itself was modest, a mirror of his own, but the fence that separated their properties was starting to fail. A long section of wooden slats sagged inward, loosened by a recent storm, looking like a tired sigh in the middle of an otherwise neat row. It wasn't his problem, not technically, but it bothered him. It looked like neglect, like something broken that no one cared enough to mend. He thought of Maya, of the world he was trying to build for her, and the image of that broken fence felt like a personal failure. He finished his coffee, rinsed the mug, and made a decision. It was a small thing, an hour of work, a handful of screws. He had the tools, he had the skill. It was the one thing he had in abundance. He walked out the back door, the morning air cool against his skin, and headed toward the dilapidated section of wood. He didn't knock on her door, didn't want to make it a transaction, he would just fix it. It's what neighbors did, or at least, what they were supposed to do. As he knelt, running his calloused hand over the splintered wood, he didn't notice the curtain in the upstairs window next door part just slightly, or the pair of eyes that watched him, not with suspicion, but with a quiet, unnerving curiosity. Catherine had been awake since dawn, not because she was an early riser, but because sleep had become a luxury she could no longer afford. It was a foreign concept in this new life, this quiet little house on this quiet little street. For months, her world had been a maelstrom of legal jargon, hushed phone calls, and the cold, sterile light of lawyers' offices. The silence here was so profound it was almost deafening. She stood by her window, a silk robe wrapped tightly around her, a relic from a life she no longer recognized as her own. She watched the man next door, her neighbor. She didn't know his name, only that he had a daughter with a laugh that carried over the fence in the afternoons. He was kneeling now, his back to her, examining the broken section of the fence with a practiced focus. His hands, even from a distance, looked strong, capable. He wore a faded t-shirt and work pants, the uniform of a man who built things, who mended what was broken. She'd spent the last year of her life surrounded by men who only knew how to tear things down. She expected him to walk away, to shake his head and return to his own yard. Instead, he disappeared into his garage and returned with a toolbox. He set it down on the grass with a soft thud and began to work. No knock on her door, no note, no request for payment, just the quiet, steady rhythm of a man fixing something that wasn't his responsibility. Catherine didn't move from the window. She just watched, mesmerized. In her world, every action had a motive, every favor, a price. Kindness was a currency, a means to an end. This was different. This was quiet. It was simple. It was a man with a hammer and a handful of nails mending a fence because it was the right thing to do. Maya came outside a little while later, a small plastic cup in each hand. She walked carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration, and offered one to her father. He stopped his work, took the cup, and drank what was likely lukewarm lemonade with a smile that transformed his tired face. Then Maya turned and looked toward Catherine's house. She hesitated for a moment, then took a few brave steps toward the property line. "Do you want some?" she called out, her voice small but clear. "My daddy says it's the best in the world." Catherine's heart clenched. She let the curtain fall back into place, her own hand trembling slightly. She didn't answer. She didn't know how. For the first time, in a very long time, someone had offered her something without knowing who she was, without wanting anything in return. And that simple, profound act of grace left her completely, utterly, breathless. He worked for over an hour, the rhythmic tap of his hammer, a steady heartbeat in the quiet morning. Leo lost himself in the work, in the simple satisfaction of aligning wood, driving nails, and making something crooked straight again. The sagging slats were now firm, the loose posts secured. It wasn't a brand new fence, but it was whole. It was mended. As he was packing up his tools, his back door creaked open and Maya emerged again, this time holding a plate with 2 slightly lopsided cookies. "For your hard work," she said, presenting them with the gravity of a royal offering. He chuckled, wiping sawdust from his hands onto his jeans. "Well, thank you, boss. Best payment a guy could ask for." He took a cookie, biting into the still warm chocolate chips. Maya stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the fence. "It looks happy now," she said. Leo looked at the fence, then down at his daughter. "Yeah, kiddo, I think it does." Just then, the back door of the house next door opened. The woman, his neighbor, stepped out. She was wearing simple jeans and a soft, cream-colored sweater, but she wore them with an elegance that seemed out of place in a suburban backyard. Her hair was tied back in a loose, effortless knot, and her face, devoid of makeup, was striking. She looked like she belonged on the cover of a magazine, not standing on a worn concrete patio. She held a glass of water in her hand, her movements hesitant as she approached the fence line. "I saw what you did," she said, her voice softer than he expected. "You didn't have to do that." Leo shrugged, feeling suddenly self-conscious under her direct gaze. "It was leaning. Figured it was better to fix it before it fell on someone's kid." He gestured vaguely with his cookie. "Specifically, mine." A small smile touched her lips, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Her eyes were guarded, holding a deep, weary caution. "Still, thank you. I'm Catherine, by the way." She extended a hand over the newly repaired fence. "Leo," he said, shaking it briefly. Her hand was soft, a stark contrast to his own calloused palm. "And this is my supervisor, Maya." Maya gave a little wave, cookie crumbs dusting her chin. Catherine's smile deepened slightly, this time with a flicker of genuine warmth. "It's a pleasure to meet you both. Can I at least pay you for the materials? For your time?" Leo shook his head immediately. "No need. It's just what neighbors do." The words hung in the air between them. Catherine stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. It was as if the concept was foreign to her, a language she hadn't heard spoken in a long time. "Well," she said, her voice quiet. "In that case, thank you, Leo." She didn't say more. She just nodded, turned, and walked back inside, leaving Leo with the strange feeling that he hadn't just fixed a fence, but had inadvertently knocked on a door he wasn't prepared to have opened. The interaction lingered with Leo for the rest of the day. It wasn't just her gratitude, which felt sincere, but the profound sadness that seemed to shadow her every move. She was a puzzle, a quiet woman living in a modest house who looked like she'd be more at home in a penthouse suite. He found himself glancing over at her house more often than he should, watching for a light in the window, a sign of life. He was sanding a set of kitchen cabinets in his workshop, the small cluttered garage that served as his primary source of income when Maya came in, a drawing clutched in her hand. It was a picture of their two houses, with a perfectly straight fence between them. On his side, a stick figure with a hammer. On her side, a woman with long, flowing hair and a crown. "It's for the queen next door," Maya announced. Leo paused, a smile tugging at his lips. "I don't think she's a queen, honey. She looks like one," Maya insisted. "She's a sad queen." The observation, so simple and so accurate, hit him with surprising force. Maya was right. There was a regal quality to Catherine, but it was steeped in melancholy. He thought about the men in suits who had dropped her off the day she moved in, the sleek black car that had disappeared as quickly as it arrived. He thought about how she rarely left the house, how the grocery delivery service was her only regular visitor. He took the drawing from Maya. "All right, let's go deliver this to the sad queen." He wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do, but the thought of Catherine alone in that house, surrounded by a silence he was starting to find unsettling, pushed him forward. He took Maya's hand, and they walked across the lawn to her front door. Before he could knock, the door opened. Catherine stood there, looking surprised, a half-empty moving box at her feet. "We brought you something," Leo said, holding up the drawing. Maya peeked out from behind his leg. Catherine crouched down, her eyes softening as she took the crayon masterpiece. She studied it for a long moment, her finger tracing the outline of the crowned figure. "This is beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she tried to hide. "Thank you, Maya." She looked up at Leo, and for the first time, the guard in her eyes seemed to lower just a fraction. "I was just trying to unpack some books. Would you two like to come in for a minute?" The invitation felt spontaneous, and for that reason, real. Leo hesitated, but Maya was already nodding eagerly. "Okay," he said, "just for a minute." The inside of her house was surprisingly sparse. Unlike the lived-in, chaotic warmth of his own home, hers was a space of clean lines and empty surfaces. A few boxes were stacked against one wall, but there were no photos, no knickknacks, no personal touches. It felt less like a home and more like a waiting room. Catherine led them to the living room, where a single, elegant couch sat facing a bare wall. She seemed to notice the emptiness through his eyes, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. "I'm still settling in," she said, the words an inadequate explanation for the profound lack of personality in the space. Maya, unconcerned with interior design, immediately spotted a stack of books and began looking at the pictures. Catherine watched her, a sad, wistful smile on her face. "You have a wonderful daughter, Leo." "She's the best part of my life," he said, his voice full of a truth that was absolute. He glanced around the room again. "You move here from the city?" The question was casual, but Catherine's posture tightened slightly. "Something like that. I needed a change, a quieter life." Her answer was vague, a polite wall he knew better than to try and climb. He understood walls. He'd built plenty of his own since his wife left, walls to protect himself, to protect Maya. He recognized the architecture of them in her. "Well," he said, sensing the moment had stretched thin. "Cedarwood is quiet, sometimes too quiet." She met his gaze, and in that moment, he saw it again, a flicker of something deep and broken, a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical presence in the room. He didn't know her story, didn't know the first thing about the woman who lived behind the sad eyes and polite smiles, but he knew the look of someone who was hiding, not just from the world, but from themselves. And that, he understood completely. The days that followed settled into a new, unspoken rhythm. Leo would work in his garage, the sound of his saw a familiar hum in the neighborhood air, and sometimes he'd see Catherine in her yard, tending to a small garden she'd started. They exchanged polite waves, quiet smiles over the fence. She never mentioned the drawing again, but he noticed it one afternoon, taped to her refrigerator, a single splash of color in her otherwise sterile kitchen. One Saturday, as Leo was trying to fix the chain on Maya's bicycle, a task that was proving more frustrating than a full kitchen remodel, Catherine appeared at the fence. She was holding a plate of freshly baked muffins. "Peace offering," she said, a hint of amusement in her voice. "You looked like you were losing a battle over there." He wiped grease from his hands and accepted the plate. "You have no idea. This chain has a personal grudge against me." He took a muffin. It was warm, studded with blueberries, and perfect. "You're a good baker. It's one of the few things I remember how to do," she said, her gaze drifting to his hands as he worked on the bike. "You're good with your hands." "Have to be," he replied, not looking up. "It's all I've got." The words were honest, not a complaint, but a simple statement of fact. She didn't offer pity, which he was grateful for. Instead, she leaned against the fence, a comfortable silence settling between them. Maya ran over, her face lighting up when she saw Catherine. "Are you staying for our picnic?" she asked, tugging on Catherine's sleeve. "We're having peanut butter sandwiches and apple juice." Catherine looked from Maya's hopeful face to Leo's, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Leo found himself answering before he'd even thought it through. "You're welcome to join. It's not exactly fine dining, but the company's decent." He gestured to Maya, who was now doing a little dance. To his surprise, Catherine smiled, a real, unguarded smile that made her look years younger. "I'd love that." They sat on a worn plaid blanket in the middle of Leo's lawn, the sun warm on their backs. Catherine ate the crustless sandwich Maya had insisted on making for her and listened with rapt attention as Maya explained the complex social hierarchy of her stuffed animals. Leo watched them, a strange feeling blooming in his chest. It had been years since he'd shared a meal with another adult in this backyard, years since anyone other than him and Maya had occupied this space. Catherine fit in a way that was both startling and incredibly natural. She didn't feel like an intruder, she felt like a missing piece. Later, as the afternoon light began to fade, Catherine helped him clean up. "Thank you for this," she said, handing him an empty juice box. "For what? A squished sandwich?" "No," she said, her voice soft. "For letting me in." Her eyes were serious, full of an unspoken gratitude that went far beyond a simple lunch. He didn't know what demon she was fighting or what life she had run from, but he knew she felt safe here, in his messy, imperfect world. And the thought that he could provide that for someone, even for an afternoon, was a feeling he hadn't realized he'd been missing. That night, after Maya was asleep, Leo sat on his back porch, staring at the stars. The house next door was dark, but he knew Catherine was in there. He could feel her presence, a quiet weight in the stillness. He had spent so long building a fortress around his and Maya's life, a fortress of routine and self-reliance. He hadn't realized how lonely it was inside until someone had gently, unexpectedly, knocked on the gate. He wasn't ready to let her in, not really, but he was no longer sure he wanted to keep her out. The following week, a heat wave descended on Cedarwood, blanketing the town in a thick, sweltering haze. The air was too heavy to breathe, and the hum of air conditioners became the town's new soundtrack. Leo's ancient window unit was fighting a losing battle, and by Tuesday it gave up completely with a final rattling sigh. He spent the afternoon in his garage, the heat oppressive, trying to coax the machine back to life, but it was no use. The compressor was shot. He stood there, sweat dripping down his back, a familiar knot of dread tightening in his stomach. A new unit would cost hundreds of dollars, money he simply didn't have. Maya, miserable in the stuffy house, had taken refuge in the shade of the big oak tree in the backyard, drawing in her notepad with a listlessness that broke his heart. He was trying to figure out his next move when Catherine appeared at the fence, a tall glass of iced tea in her hand. "You look like you're melting," she said, her voice laced with concern. He ran a hand through his damp hair. "The AC died. I'm trying to figure out a plan B. It's unbearable in the house, isn't it?" she asked, her gaze drifting to where Maya sat, looking flushed and tired. He nodded, the frustration evident in his posture. "I'll figure something out." Catherine hesitated, then said, "My central air is working just fine. It's cool inside. Why don't you two come over for a while? At least, until the sun goes down." Leo's pride flared instantly. He didn't want to take charity, didn't want to be a project. "We're fine, but thank you." "I'm not offering a handout, Leo," she said, her tone firm but gentle. "I'm offering a place to cool down. I'm making a salad for dinner. I made too much. It would be a shame for it to go to waste." She was giving him an out, a way to accept without feeling like he was admitting defeat. He looked at Maya, who was now fanning herself with her drawing pad, and his pride receded. This wasn't about him, it was about her. "Okay," he said, his voice quiet. "Thank you, Catherine." He didn't know it then, but stepping into the cool, conditioned air of her home was another step across a threshold he hadn't intended to cross. It was another brick coming loose from the wall he'd so carefully built. The cool air inside Catherine's house was a shock to the system, a welcome relief that made Leo's shoulders drop in a way he hadn't realized they'd been tensed. The house was still sparse, but it felt different today. A vase of wildflowers, likely from her garden, sat on the small dining table. A few more books had escaped their boxes and now rested in a neat stack by the couch. It was starting to look like someone was tentatively, cautiously, beginning to live there. Maya, revived by the cool air, immediately asked if she could watch a cartoon, and Catherine set her up on the couch with a remote and a bowl of grapes, her movements natural and easy. Leo stood awkwardly in the entryway, feeling out of place. This was her space, her sanctuary. He was an intruder, a neighbor in need. Catherine seemed to sense his discomfort. "Can you help me with this?" she asked, gesturing to a large, flat-packed box in the corner. "It's supposed to be a bookshelf. The instructions look like they were written in a language from another planet." He smiled, relief washing over him. This, he could do. This was familiar territory. He knelt and opened the box, the scent of fresh-cut particle board filling the air. He laid out the pieces, his hands moving with the practiced confidence of a man who understood how things fit together. Catherine sat on the floor nearby, handing him screws and dowels, watching him work. "I've never seen someone build something without yelling at the instructions," she said, a hint of awe in her voice. "The trick is to know the instructions are always wrong," he replied, not looking up. They worked in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the whir of his screwdriver and the faint chatter of the television. He was acutely aware of her presence beside him, the scent of her perfume, something light and clean, like rain, the soft sound of her breathing. It was an intimacy he hadn't shared with anyone in years, this quiet, collaborative act of building something. When the bookshelf was finally assembled and standing steady against the wall, they both stood back to admire their work. It was a simple piece of furniture, but it felt like more. It was the first real piece of a home in this empty house. "It's perfect," Catherine said, her voice soft. "Thank you. It's what I do," he said, but the words felt different this time. He wasn't just a handyman, he was helping a friend. He was helping her build a life here. Later, as they ate salad and grilled chicken at her small table, he found himself talking more than he usually did. He told her about his dream of one day opening his own small workshop, not just a garage, but a real studio where he could build custom furniture. He told her about Maya's mother, about the sudden illness that had taken her, about the gaping hole it had left in their lives. He didn't know why he was telling her these things. The words just came, spilling into the cool, quiet air of her home. Catherine listened without interrupting, her eyes full of a deep, empathetic sadness that wasn't pity. It was understanding. And when he finished, she didn't offer platitudes or easy comforts. She just reached across the table and briefly, gently, touched his hand. "You're a good man, Leo," she said. And in that moment, sitting in her half-empty house, sharing a meal he hadn't planned on, he felt a flicker of something he'd thought was long extinguished, hope. The bookshelf became a silent landmark in their budding friendship. Over the next few weeks, Catherine slowly, deliberately, began to fill it. It started with the books that had been languishing in boxes, their spines a colorful mix of classic novels and modern poetry. Then, a small framed photo appeared on one of the shelves. It wasn't of a person, but of a windswept coastline, the sea a turbulent gray blue. "Where was that taken?" Leo asked one afternoon as he was returning a borrowed lawnmower. She traced the frame with her finger. "A place I used to go to think. A long time ago." Another week, a small, hand-carved wooden bird joined the scene. It was elegant, simple, its wings poised for flight. It looked expensive. He didn't ask where it came from. He was learning that Catherine's past was a country with closed borders. You only got to see the parts she chose to show you. Their time together fell into a comfortable, unspoken routine. She'd bring over coffee in the mornings. He'd help her with a leaky faucet or a stubborn window. Maya was the bridge that connected their two worlds, her laughter and endless chatter filling the spaces their own quiet hesitations left empty. She adored Catherine, following her around the garden, helping her water the flowers, and confiding in her with the solemn secrets of a 7-year-old. Leo watched their bond grow, with a mixture of gratitude and a deep, gnawing fear. He was letting Catherine into their lives, into Maya's life. He was letting himself rely on her quiet presence, on the way her smile could ease the knot of worry in his chest. But he still knew nothing about her, about the life that had put that sadness in her eyes. The questions lingered in the back of his mind. Who was the man in the suit who had dropped her off? Why were there no pictures of family or friends on her new bookshelf? What was she healing from? One evening, as they sat on her back porch, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance, the silence stretched a little longer than usual. "You never talk about where you came from," he said, his voice casual, an attempt to mask the directness of the question. Catherine's hands tightened around her glass. She stared out at the darkening yard. "Because sometimes, where you come from is a place you'd rather forget." "Running from something?" he asked gently. She turned to him, her expression a mixture of vulnerability and defiance. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm running toward something. I'm just not sure I'll recognize it when I find it." The answer was another wall, but this time he felt like she was inviting him to look over it, to see the landscape of her fear without demanding he understand it. He didn't push. He just sat with her in the gathering dusk, the air thick with unspoken truths and the fragile beginnings of a trust that both of them were terrified to break. The first sign of trouble arrived in a sleek black sedan that purred to a stop in front of Catherine's house on a crisp autumn morning. The car was so out of place on their quiet suburban street that it looked like it had been photoshopped into the scene. A man in a tailored suit, his hair slicked back and his face a mask of polite impatience, stepped out and walked directly to Catherine's front door. He didn't knock, he used a key. Leo was in his driveway, loading tools into his truck, and he froze, his hand resting on the tailgate. He watched as the man disappeared inside. The door shut, with a quiet, final click. A few minutes later, he could hear Ray's voice sound sharp and insistent, the other low and strained, Catherine's voice. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the sound of her carefully constructed piece being shattered. He clenched his jaw, his knuckles white against the cold metal of the truck. He had no right to interfere, no place in whatever drama was unfolding in her living room, but the protective instinct that roared to life inside him was primal, undeniable. After what felt like an eternity, the man stormed out, his face flushed with anger. He shot a venomous glance across the lawn at Leo, a look of pure, unadulterated disdain, before getting back into the car and speeding away, leaving a trail of disturbed silence in his wake. The front door to Catherine's house remained closed. No lights came on. The stillness was heavier now, more ominous. Leo waited, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to go to her, to knock on the door and make sure she was okay. But he was just the neighbor, the handyman. What comfort could he possibly offer against a storm that clearly had its origins in a world far removed from his own? He stood there for a long time, torn between his desire to help and the fear of overstepping. Finally, he walked back to his own house, the weight of her silence settling over him like a shroud. He didn't know who that man was, but he knew one thing for certain. Catherine's past had found her. And he was terrified it was going to pull her away. Catherine didn't emerge from her house for 2 days. The curtains remained drawn, the porch light off. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the quiet but steady presence she had become in his life. Leo found himself watching her house constantly, his chest tight with a worry he couldn't name. Maya felt it too. "Is the Queen okay?" she asked at dinner, pushing her peas around her plate. "I haven't seen her in the garden." "I'm sure she's just busy, honey," Leo said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. On the third day, he couldn't stand it anymore. He baked a loaf of banana bread, the one recipe his wife had taught him, the one thing he could make that tasted like comfort. With the warm loaf wrapped in a tea towel, he walked over to her door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knocked softly. The silence on the other side was so complete, he thought she might not be home. He was about to turn away when the lock clicked and the door opened a few inches. Catherine stood in the shadows of her hallway. She looked pale, exhausted. The careful poise she usually wore had crumbled, replaced by a raw, fragile vulnerability. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she'd been crying. "Leo," she said, her voice hoarse. "Hi, sorry to bother you. I made too much of this." He held out the bread, feeling foolish and inadequate. She looked at the offering, then up at him, and a single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She didn't try to wipe it away. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. She hesitated, then nodded, stepping back to let him pass. The living room was a mess. Books were knocked off the new shelf, papers were scattered across the floor, and a shattered glass lay in a glittering pile near the fireplace. It was a scene of quiet devastation. "What happened?" he asked, setting the bread down on the table. "Who was that man?" She sank onto the couch, wrapping her arms around herself as if to hold the pieces together. "That was my ex-husband's lawyer," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "He came to deliver the final divorce papers. And a message." Leo waited, his fists clenched at his sides. "My ex-husband Richard is not pleased that I walked away from the settlement he offered. He thinks I'm hiding assets. He thinks this," she gestured vaguely at the simple, sparsely furnished room, "is all some kind of performance. He's threatened to make my life very difficult if I don't comply with his demands." Leo's blood ran cold. Ex-husband. Settlement. This was not the story of a woman escaping a simple, bad relationship. This was something else entirely. "Catherine, who are you?" he asked, the question hanging in the air between them, heavy and overdue. She finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a weary, heartbreaking resignation. "My full name is Catherine Thorne," she said. Before the divorce, it was Catherine Allister, as in Allister Holdings. The name hit him like a physical blow. Allister Holdings was a name everyone knew, a global empire of tech, finance, and real estate. It was a name synonymous with unimaginable wealth and power. The quiet woman next door, the one who baked muffins and helped his daughter with her homework, was an heiress, a billionaire, the sad queen. It all clicked into place: the car, the clothes, the sadness in her eyes. It was the sadness of a gilded cage. He stared at her, the pieces of the puzzle reassembling in his mind to form a picture he didn't recognize. The woman he thought he knew was a stranger, a ghost from a world he couldn't even imagine. And in that moment, the fragile bridge of trust they had built between their two worlds seemed to crumble into dust. He sank into the chair across from her, the silence in the room now filled with the deafening roar of the truth. Catherine Thorne. He said the name in his head, testing its weight. It felt heavy, cold, made of marble and steel. It didn't fit the woman who sat on his lawn eating peanut butter sandwiches. It didn't fit the woman who cried over a crayon drawing. Leo felt a chasm open between them, wide and terrifying. He wasn't just a carpenter living next to a quiet neighbor. He was a working-class single dad living next to one of the wealthiest women in the country. The power imbalance was staggering, a third presence in the room that suffocated the air. "Why here?" he finally asked, his voice rough. "Of all the places you could have gone, why this house, this street?" "Because it was the opposite of everything I knew," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the floor. "My grandfather owned this house decades ago. It was the only property not tied up in trusts and corporate entities. It was mine, And mine alone. It was small. It was real. I wanted to remember what that felt like. He thought of his own life, the constant struggle, the worry that was a permanent resident in the back of his mind. His reality was her escape. The thought was a bitter pill to swallow. "So this was all an experiment?" he asked, a sharp edge to his voice he couldn't control. "Living like the little people to see how it feels?" Her head snapped up, her eyes flashing with a pain that was sharp and immediate. "No, that's not fair, Leo. That's not what this was." "Then what was it, Catherine?" he asked, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you were playing a part, and me and my daughter, we were just characters in your little play." The accusation hung between them, cruel and heavy. He knew it was born of his own shock and insecurity, but he couldn't take it back. He saw the look on her face, the way his words landed like a physical blow, and a part of him wanted to apologize, to soften the impact. But the other part, the proud, wounded part, felt a need to put distance between them, to re-establish the walls she had so easily breached. "I should go," he said, standing abruptly. He couldn't look at her, couldn't bear to see the wreckage he was leaving behind. He walked to the door, the banana bread, sitting untouched on her table, a symbol of a kindness that now felt naive, misplaced. "Leo, wait," she called after him, her voice cracking. But he didn't stop. He walked out into the cool air, the door clicking shut behind him, and the sound echoed the closing of something he hadn't even known had opened. He had his answer. He knew who she was. And in knowing, he felt like he'd lost her completely. The days that followed were steeped in a thick, uncomfortable silence. Leo avoided his backyard, keeping to the garage, the noise of his tools a welcome distraction from the thoughts that plagued him. He didn't see Catherine. Her car remained in the driveway, but the house was still, the curtains drawn. The fence he had mended now felt like a border, a line he was forbidden to cross. The silence infected his own home. Maya was quiet, withdrawn. She stopped asking about Catherine, her small face a canvas of confusion and hurt. She knew something was wrong, and her quiet sorrow was a constant, painful reminder of Leo's own cowardice. He had run. He had let his pride and his fear build a wall higher than any fence. One evening, as he was tucking Maya into bed, she held up the drawing she'd made for Catherine, its edges now soft and worn. "Daddy, are we mad at the Queen?" she asked, her voice small. Leo sat on the edge of her bed, his heart aching. "No, honey, we're not mad." "Then why don't we see her anymore?" she pressed. "It's complicated," he said, the word a poor excuse for the storm of emotions he couldn't articulate. Maya looked down at the drawing. "Mommy used to say that nothing is too complicated for a cookie and a hug." The simple, profound wisdom of a child cut through his defenses. His wife had said that countless times. He had been so consumed by Catherine's identity, by her wealth, that he had forgotten the person. He had forgotten the woman who had cried over his daughter's drawing, who had listened to his stories with an open heart, who had brought him iced tea on a hot day because she saw he was struggling. He had focused on the name, not the person. The next morning he found an envelope on his doorstep. It was thick, creamy white, with his name written in Catherine's elegant script. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a letter, several pages long. "Leo," it began, "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I hope you will let me explain. You were right to be angry. I wasn't honest with you, and I am so sorry for the pain that caused. I wasn't playing a part. The person you met, the woman who sat on your lawn and ate your daughter's sandwiches, that was the most real version of me I have ever been." He read on, his vision blurring. She told him everything. About the suffocating world she was born into. About the arranged marriage that was more of a merger. About the emotional cruelty of a husband who saw her as an asset, not a wife. She wrote about her desperate need to escape, to find a place where she could breathe, where her name didn't enter the room before she did. "You and Maya, you gave me that," she wrote. "You showed me a kindness I had forgotten existed. You didn't want anything from me. You just saw me, and in letting me into your world, you saved me from my own." The letter ended with a simple, heartbreaking plea. "I know our worlds are different. I know I have no right to ask anything of you. But the life I had before I met you is not a life I want to return to. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I don't want to face it alone. I'm not asking you to fix my life, Leo. I'm just asking you not to shut me out of yours." He read the letter 3 times, the paper crinkling in his shaking hands. The anger and betrayal he had felt had evaporated, replaced by a profound, aching empathy. He had been so focused on how her world made him feel small that he had failed to see how his world had made her feel whole. He folded the letter, tucked it into his pocket, and knew what he had to do. He couldn't let fear write the end of this story. With the letter tucked safely in his pocket, feeling like both a wound and a balm against his chest, Leo knew the silence had gone on long enough. He wasn't a man of grand gestures or eloquent speeches. His language was in his hands, in the things he could build and mend. He went into his workshop, the scent of sawdust and wood stain a familiar comfort. He pulled out a piece of reclaimed maple, its grain rich and full of character, a piece he had been saving for a special project he hadn't yet defined. Now, he knew its purpose. He worked for hours, the world outside fading away, until all that existed was the wood, the tools, and the clear, focused intention in his mind. He sanded, he carved, he measured. He poured all of the things he couldn't say, his regret, his fear, his hope into the object taking shape beneath his hands. When he was finished, he held it up to the light. It was a small, intricately carved jewelry box. It was simple, unadorned, its beauty lying in the natural grain of the wood and the care with which it had been made. It was honest. It was real. He walked across the lawn, his boots damp with morning dew, and placed the box on Catherine's doorstep. He didn't include a note. The box itself was the note. It was his apology, his answer, his invitation. He knocked once, a firm, steady sound, and then walked away without waiting for her to answer. He trusted that she would understand. Catherine heard the knock from her living room, where she had been sitting for hours, staring at a blank wall. She had packed a bag. She had called a car. She had decided that leaving was the kindest thing she could do, for him, for Maya, his. Silence had been her answer, and she had accepted it with a heavy, broken heart. But the sound of that knock was different. It wasn't tentative or demanding. It was solid. She walked to the door and opened it, expecting to find no one there. But on the mat sat the wooden box. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the smooth, polished surface. It was warm, as if the person who made it had just set it down. She opened the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet he must have salvaged from an old case, was a single, perfect, hand-carved dandelion seed, poised as if ready to take flight. Her breath caught in her throat. A dandelion seed, a symbol of wishes, of resilience, of beauty in the most unexpected places. It was the first thing Maya had chased across the lawn that day he fixed the fence. He remembered. He understood. It wasn't about money or status. It was about listening. It was about seeing. Tears streamed down her face. But for the first time in days, they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. She looked across the lawn and saw him standing on his own porch, watching her, his expression a mixture of hope and fear. She didn't wave. She just held the box to her chest, a silent promise passing between them. The car she had called could wait. She wasn't going anywhere. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the neighborhood, there was a soft knock on Leo's door. When he opened it, Catherine was standing there. She wasn't wearing a silk robe or a designer sweater. She was in a simple t-shirt and jeans, her hair pulled back, her face free of makeup. She looked like herself. She was holding a plate of cookies. "I made too many," she said, a small, tremulous smile on her face. He smiled back, a real easy smile that reached his eyes. "I was hoping you would." He stepped aside, holding the door open for her. The house was filled with the smell of his cooking, and Maya's laughter could be heard from the living room. It was messy, it was loud, it was imperfect. It was home. Catherine stepped inside, leaving the ghosts of her past on the porch. She didn't know what their future would look like, how they would navigate the vast differences in their worlds. But as she stepped into the warmth of his life, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. They would figure it out together. The wall between their worlds, once so high and impenetrable, had been replaced by a bridge, built not with money or power, but with a handful of nails, a crayon drawing, and a single, hand-carved dandelion seed. The air in the car was thick with a silence that felt different from the ones they had shared before. It wasn't heavy with unspoken truths or laden with caution. It was a comfortable, lived, in quiet. The kind that only exists between two people who no longer need words to understand each other. Leo drove, his hand steady on the wheel of his old truck, while Catherine sat in the passenger seat, her gaze fixed on the passing landscape of rolling hills and autumn-touched trees. In the back, Maya was humming softly, a comic book open in her lap, completely at ease. They were on their way to the annual Cedarwood Fall Festival, an event Leo and Maya had attended every year. This year, Catherine was coming with them. It felt both monumentally significant and perfectly natural. "Are you sure about this?" Leo asked, his voice low. "It's the town's biggest gossip event of the year. People will be staring." "Let them stare," Catherine said, turning to him with a smile. "I've been stared at my whole life for being an Alistair. I'd much rather be stared at for being with you." The simple, unwavering confidence in her voice settled something deep inside him. He reached over and squeezed her hand, his rough, calloused fingers lacing with her smooth ones. The festival was a kaleidoscope of small-town charm. The air smelled of kettle corn, apple cider, and hay. Strings of colored lights were strung between oak trees, and the sound of a local bluegrass band filled the air. As they walked through the crowds, Leo felt the familiar weight of curious glances. He saw neighbors whisper behind their hands, their eyes flicking from Catherine's elegant coat to his own worn flannel. But Catherine didn't flinch. She held her head high, smiling warmly at anyone who met her gaze. She bought a bag of roasted almonds, sharing them with Maya. She tried her hand at the ring toss, laughing when she missed every single shot. She was not the reclusive, sad queen hiding in her house anymore. She was just Kate, a woman enjoying a day at the fair. The turning point came when they ran into Mrs. Gable, the town's most notorious and well-meaning busybody. She cornered them near the pie-baking contest, her eyes alight with insatiable curiosity. "Catherine, dear," she exclaimed, "we were all so worried when we heard about, well, you know, the unpleasantness with your divorce. Such a terrible ordeal for a woman of your standing." Before Catherine could respond, Leo stepped forward slightly, placing a protective arm around her. "She's doing just fine, Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We're all doing just fine." It was a small gesture, a simple sentence, but it was a declaration. He was no longer just the neighbor. He was standing with her, publicly, unapologetically. Mrs. Gable, momentarily taken aback, just nodded and scurried away to spread the new development. Catherine looked up at Leo, her eyes shining with an emotion so profound it stole her breath. He hadn't just defended her, he had claimed her. He had drawn a line in the sand and dared the world to cross it. Later that night, as they watched the fireworks display paint the dark sky with bursts of color, Maya asleep on a blanket between them, Catherine leaned her head on Leo's shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For not letting me be Catherine Alistair today." He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer. "You were never just Catherine Alistair to me," he said. "You were always just Kate." The crisp autumn air gave way to the sharp bite of early winter, and the rhythm of their life together solidified into something steady and strong. Catherine's house was no longer a sterile waiting room, it was a home. The bookshelf was overflowing. The walls now held framed photos of Maya's artwork, and the kitchen was constantly filled with the scent of Catherine's increasingly confident baking experiments. The town's curiosity had softened into a quiet, protective acceptance. They had seen her at the grocery store, at the school's bake sale, at the hardware store, asking Leo's advice on the best type of wood sealant. She wasn't a headline anymore. She was a neighbor. She was Leo's Kate. One snowy Saturday, a registered letter arrived for Catherine. It was from the board of Allister Holdings, a formal summons to a meeting in the city. Her ex-husband was making a new play for Control, and her presence was required. The news settled a familiar cold dread in her stomach. Leo saw it on her face the moment she read the letter. "What is it?" he asked. "I have to go back," she said, her voice small. "Just for a day. They need me." He didn't try to talk her out of it. He just nodded. "When do you leave?" The night before she left, he found her on the back porch, staring out at the snow-covered yard. "I'm scared," she admitted, her breath fogging in the cold air. "I'm scared that the moment I step back into that world, it will swallow me whole again. That I'll forget who I am here." He stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. He held up the small wooden dandelion seed he had carved for her, which she now wore on a simple leather cord around her neck. "Then take this with you," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "And remember that you're not the woman who left that world. You're the woman who came back to this one. You're stronger than you think, Kate." She leaned back against him, drawing strength from his steady presence. She was no longer running from her past. She was walking toward her future, and she knew, with a certainty that was bone deep, that she would be coming home. The Allister Holdings boardroom was exactly as she remembered. A cavern of polished mahogany, smoked glass, and cold, calculated ambition. The men around the table were the same ones who had watched her crumble, who had used her as a pawn in their corporate chess game. Her ex-husband Richard sat at the opposite end, his face a mask of smug confidence. He thought he had her trapped. He started the meeting by outlining his new proposal, a hostile takeover disguised as a merger, a plan that would effectively erase her family's legacy and consolidate power under his name. He expected her to be silent, to be the broken, pliable woman who had fled to the suburbs. He was wrong. When he finished, Catherine stood up. She wasn't wearing a power suit. She was in a simple, dark blue dress, the wooden dandelion seed resting against her collarbone. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She spoke with a calm, unshakable clarity that silenced the room. She dismantled Richard's proposal point by point, not with emotional appeals, but with a sharp, incisive logic that left him speechless. She exposed the flaws, the greed, the short-sightedness of his plan. She reminded the board of the company's original values, the ones her grandfather had built it, on innovation, integrity, and a commitment to people, not just profits. But she didn't stop there. She then laid out her own vision, a new direction for the company, one that invested in sustainable technologies, in community development, in creating a legacy that was about more than just stock prices. It was bold, it was visionary, and it was undeniably brilliant. When she was done, the room was silent. Richard's smug expression had been replaced by one of stunned disbelief. The board members looked at her not as the broken heiress, but as the leader they hadn't realized they'd been waiting for. She had not just reclaimed her seat at the table, she had rebuilt the table itself. She left the city that same evening, not with a sense of triumph, but with a sense of peace. She had faced her past, not by erasing it, but by reshaping it. She had found her voice, not in the quiet of her garden, but in the heart of the storm. As the car sped away from the glittering skyline, she knew she wasn't leaving anything behind. She was simply going home. The first spring thaw arrived, and with it, a sense of new beginnings. The snow melted, the ground softened, and the world seemed to exhale after a long, cold winter. One sunny afternoon, Leo was in his workshop, putting the finishing touches on a custom-built cradle for a new family in town. The door was open, and the scent of sawdust mingled with the fresh, earthy smell of spring. Catherine walked in, her boots muddy from the garden, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She was holding a large, rolled-up piece of paper. "I have a proposal for you," she said, her eyes dancing with an excitement he hadn't seen before. He set down his sander and wiped his hands on his jeans. "I'm not wearing a suit, but I'll hear you out." She spread the paper out on his workbench. It was a set of architectural blueprints. He leaned over, his brow furrowed in confusion as he studied the plans. It was a design for a large, state-of-the-art workshop, complete with a showroom, a finishing room, and a small office. At the top, in elegant lettering, were the words, "Thorn, Morgan Woodworks." He stared at the blueprints, then up at her, speechless. "I bought the old abandoned warehouse down by the river," she said, her voice soft but sure. "I want to partner with you, Leo. I'll handle the business side, the boring stuff. You just build. You create. You do what you were born to do." He swallowed, his throat tight with emotion. "Kate, I can't. This is too much." "It's not a gift," she said, stepping closer and placing her hand on his arm. "It's an investment. I am investing in you, in your talent, in us. We build things together, remember?" He looked from the blueprints to her face, her eyes shining with unwavering belief in him. For years, he had been patching, mending, just trying to keep things from falling apart. She was offering him the chance to build something from the ground up, something that was theirs. It was a future he had never dared to dream of. "What do you say, Carpenter?" she asked, a hopeful smile on her face. "Are you ready to build a life with me?" He didn't have to think. He just pulled her into his arms, the scent of sawdust and soil and spring mingling between them. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with a gratitude so immense it felt like it could fill the sky. Yes. The grand opening of Thorn, Morgan Woodworks, was on a sun-drenched Saturday in June. The warehouse, once a derelict shell, was now a stunning testament to their shared vision. Sunlight streamed through massive new windows, illuminating the gleaming tools and the beautiful handcrafted furniture that filled the showroom. The whole town of Cedarwood turned out, filling the space with laughter, music, and the smell of fresh-cut wood. Leo stood near the entrance, a glass of champagne in his hand, though he had yet to take a sip. He wore a new shirt, but his hands were still the same strong, calloused, the hands of a man who built things. He watched Catherine move through the crowd, greeting guests, her face glowing with a happiness that was radiant and real. She was no longer hiding. She was home. Maya, now a year older and a few inches taller, was giving official tours of the workshop, her voice full of pride as she explained what each machine did. She led a small group to a corner of the showroom where a collection of exquisite, hand-carved dandelion seeds were displayed on a pedestal. "My daddy made these," she announced. "They're for wishing." Later, when the crowds had thinned and the sun began to dip below the horizon, Leo found Catherine on the new loading dock, looking out at the river. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange. "You did it, Leo," she said, slipping her hand into his. "You built this." "We built this," he corrected, pulling her close. He looked around at the workshop, at the town in the distance, at the woman beside him. His life was no longer a series of patched-together pieces. It was a beautiful, solid structure, built on a foundation of trust, resilience, and a love that had taken root in the most unexpected of places. "You know," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "I'm glad my fence broke." Catherine laughed, a sound that was pure and free. She leaned up and kissed him, a long, slow kiss that tasted of champagne and sawdust and forever. "Me too," she whispered against his lips. "Me too." They stood there as the last of the light faded, two people from two different worlds who had found their way to each other, not in spite of their differences, but because of them. They had mended more than a fence, they had mended each other. And in the quiet of the coming night, surrounded by the things they had built, they knew they were finally, completely, home.